June 30th, 1944, 4:12 a.m. The jungle outside Nomfor Island, Dutch New Guinea. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamada crouched in the darkness beneath a canopy so thick that even moonlight could not penetrate. The air was a living thing, humid, pressing, suffocating. Mosquitoes whined in clouds. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird called, its voice sharp and alien. Yamada's uniform clung to his skin, soaked through with sweat despite the pre-dawn chill. His Type 38 rifle rested across his knees, its bolt oiled and ready. He had been fighting in the Pacific for 2 years. He had survived Rabaul, survived Buna, survived places whose names he could no longer remember. He knew the jungle. He knew the Americans. Or he thought he did. The Americans were predictable. They came from the sea in their landing craft, thousands of them, supported by naval gunfire and airstrikes that turned beaches into moonscapes. They fought with overwhelming firepower but little finesse. They advanced slowly, methodically, grinding forward with tanks and artillery. The Imperial Japanese Army had learned to dig in, to fortify, to make the Americans pay in blood for every meter of ground. It was a war of attrition, and attrition favored the defender. But at 4:47 a.m., Yamada heard a sound he did not recognize. It was soft at first, almost lost beneath the rustle of palm fronds and the hum of insects. A whisper, a hiss, like wind through fabric. He tilted his head, listening. The sound grew louder. Not wind, something else, something unnatural. Then he saw them. Shapes descending from the sky, white against the purple darkness of dawn. Dozens of them, hundreds. They drifted down like ghosts, like falling blossoms, silent except for that strange susurrus, the sound of silk parachutes billowing in the tropical air. Yamada's breath caught. For a moment, he could not move. He had heard stories, of course, intelligence reports from other theaters. The Americans had paratroopers, elite soldiers who jumped from aircraft and landed behind enemy lines. But those were European tactics, Normandy, Sicily. The Pacific was different. The jungle, the heat, the terrain, none of it suited airborne operations. The idea that the Americans would attempt it here seemed absurd. And yet, there they were. Yamada raised his rifle, sighted on the nearest parachute, and fired. The shot cracked through the jungle. The parachute kept falling. Others landed in the trees, in the undergrowth, on the edges of the airstrip his unit was supposed to defend. Within minutes, the sound of gunfire erupted all around him. American carbines, Japanese rifles, the stutter of machine guns. The jungle exploded into chaos. By sunrise, Yamada's unit was encircled. The Americans had not come from the sea, they had come from the sky. The Japanese High Command had always considered American paratroopers a curiosity, a novelty, perhaps even a joke. In the early years of the Pacific War, when Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia with lightning speed, the concept of airborne infantry seemed unnecessary. The Imperial Army relied on speed, surprise, and infantry excellence. Japanese soldiers were trained to march 20 miles a day through jungle and mountain, to endure conditions that would break lesser men. They did not need parachutes. They did not need gimmicks. When intelligence reports arrived in 1943 detailing the formation of American airborne divisions, the 11th Airborne, the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment, Japanese officers dismissed them. One staff officer in Rabaul reportedly laughed and said, "Let them jump. The jungle will kill them before we do." Another called airborne operations theater, suitable for propaganda films but useless in real combat. The terrain of the Pacific, dense jungle, swamp, coral ridges, seemed incompatible with parachute drops. Where would they land? How would they resupply? What purpose would they serve that amphibious landings could not accomplish more safely? The answers came in 1944, and they came hard. The 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment, known as the Rock, was the first American airborne unit deployed to the Pacific. Formed in 1941, they had trained in the deserts of California and the forests of Australia, learning to jump from C-47 transport aircraft, to land in hostile territory, to fight with light weapons and limited supplies. They were volunteers, every one of them. Paratroopers earned extra pay, $50 a month, a princely sum in 1943, but the money was not why they jumped. They jumped because it was the hardest thing the Army offered. They jumped because it meant something. In September 1943, the 503rd conducted its first combat jump at Nadzab, New Guinea, in support of Australian forces. The drop was a success. The Japanese were caught completely off guard, but it was a small operation, a test. The real shock came nearly a year later at Noimfor. Noimfor Island was critical. Its airstrips could support long-range bombers and fighters needed to strike deeper into Japanese-held territory. The Japanese knew this. They fortified the island with over 3,000 troops, dug bunkers and trenches, stockpiled ammunition. When the Americans landed on June 2, 1944, they expected a conventional amphibious assault. They were right at first. The 158th Infantry Regiment stormed the beaches, fought through fierce resistance, and began pushing inland. Then, on June 30th, the sky opened. At dawn, 739 paratroopers of the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment jumped from C-47s flying at just 400 feet, dangerously low, intended to minimize drift in the wind. They came down on Kamiri Airfield, directly behind Japanese lines. The drop was chaotic. Men landed in trees, on coral outcrops, some on the airstrip itself. Several were injured on landing, but they were there. They were armed, and they were between the Japanese defenders and their supply lines. Lieutenant Yamada and his comrades had prepared for an attack from the east, from the beaches. They had not prepared for an attack from above. Yamada survived the first day, barely. His unit, a reinforced company tasked with holding the southern edge of the airfield, found itself surrounded by American paratroopers who seemed to materialize from nowhere. One moment the jungle was empty. The next, American soldiers in mottled camouflage uniforms were firing from behind trees, lobbing grenades, moving with a speed and aggression that Yamada had not seen before. These were not the slow, methodical Americans he had fought at Buna. These were different, faster, lighter. They carried folding stock carbines, Thompson submachine guns, and enough grenades to supply a platoon. They moved in small teams, communicating with hand signals, flanking Japanese positions before his men could react. When Yamada's squad tried to fall back to a secondary trench line, they found Americans already there, waiting. By midday, Yamada's company had been reduced to 30 men. By evening, 15. They retreated into the jungle, abandoning the airfield, abandoning their supplies, abandoning the dead. Yamada did not sleep that night. Every sound made him flinch. Every rustle of leaves could be an American patrol. The sound of silk, that soft, hissing whisper, haunted him. He kept imagining more parachutes falling, more Americans dropping from the sky. He was not wrong. On July 3rd, the 503rd conducted a second jump at Noimfor. This time, 890 paratroopers descended on Namber Airfield. Again, the Japanese were unprepared. Again, the Americans landed behind their lines, cutting off retreats, isolating strong points, creating havoc. The Japanese defense collapsed within days. By July 6th, Noimfor was in American hands. The cost to the 503rd? 72 killed, 203 wounded. The cost to the Japanese garrison? Over 2,000 dead. The rest scattered into the jungle to starve or surrender. Yamada was among the scattered. He survived for another 2 weeks, living on roots and insects, before dysentery and exhaustion rendered him unable to walk. Australian troops found him on July 20th, delirious and half dead. He was the only survivor from his original company. There was a peculiar object the American paratroopers carried that became legendary among Japanese survivors. It was not a weapon, though it could be as demoralizing as one. It was a ration tin, small, rectangular, olive drab. The Americans called it a K-ration. Yamada saw one for the first time after his capture. An Australian medic treating his dysentery handed him a tin and showed him how to open it. Inside, crackers, canned meat, powdered coffee, chocolate, cigarettes, chewing gum, an entire meal, compact and self-contained. The medic opened another tin, another meal. He opened a third. The Australian shrugged and said in broken Japanese, "They dropped these with the soldiers, thousands." Yamada stared at the rations. For 2 weeks he had eaten nothing but wild taro and beetles. His ribs showed through his skin. His gums bled from scurvy. And here were the Americans jumping out of airplanes, landing in enemy territory, carrying more food in a single pack than a Japanese soldier might see in a week. It was not just the food, it was what the food represented. The Americans could afford to drop men from the sky deep behind enemy lines and supply them so well that they carried luxuries, chocolate, gum, cigarettes as standard issue. The Imperial Army, meanwhile, could barely feed its frontline troops. Resupply convoys were sunk by American submarines. Airstrips were bombed. Soldiers foraged, starved, died of malnutrition as often as combat. The K-ration became a symbol, not of American generosity, but of American abundance, of an enemy so wealthy, so industrial, so logistically superior that it could wage war with a wastefulness that seemed almost obscene. The Japanese had mocked American paratroopers as soft, as theatrical, but the paratroopers had landed with enough supplies to fight for days without resupply. The Japanese defenders, by contrast, had starved. The success at Nomfor changed American strategy in the Pacific. Airborne operations, once considered impractical in jungle terrain, were now proven effective. The 503rd would jump again in February 1945 at Corregidor in one of the most daring airborne assaults of the war. The 11th Airborne Division would conduct combat jumps in the Philippines, securing key objectives and disrupting Japanese defenses. But the impact on Japanese morale was perhaps greater than the tactical gains. For years, Japanese propaganda had portrayed the Americans as weak, decadent, unwilling to endure hardship. The image of American soldiers jumping from airplanes, landing in hostile jungles, and fighting their way out shattered that narrative. These were not soft men. These were warriors who volunteered for the most dangerous duty their army offered. Yamada, recovering in a POW camp in Australia, heard other survivors speak of the paratroopers with something approaching awe. One soldier, a sergeant who had fought at Nadzab, said quietly, "They fall from the sky like kami, but they are not spirits, they are men, and they do not stop." There is a recording made in 1985 of a veteran from the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment named Frank Arrigo. He is describing the jump at Nomfor. His voice is old, wavering, but clear. He says, "We were scared, every one of us. You'd be crazy not to be. 400 feet, that's nothing. You pull your chute, and you've got maybe 5 seconds before you hit. Some guys landed in trees and broke bones. Some landed on coral and couldn't walk. But we jumped anyway. That's what paratroopers do. You jump." It was that willingness to jump into the unknown, into danger, into chaos, that the Japanese had underestimated. They had seen American wealth and assumed it bred weakness. They had seen American abundance and assumed it bred softness. They had not understood that abundance could also breed confidence, that wealth could be turned into wings, that democracy, for all its inefficiencies, could produce men willing to throw themselves out of airplanes at dawn, behind enemy lines, with nothing but a rifle and a K-ration and the absolute belief that they would win.
By late 1944, Japanese intelligence reports no longer dismissed American paratroopers. They cataloged them, they studied them, they feared them. One report, captured after the war, described the 503rd as ghost soldiers who strike from above, bypass defenses, and disrupt command. Another noted grimly, American airborne forces possess morale and supply advantages that render conventional defensive tactics insufficient. The laughter had stopped. Takeshi Yamada was repatriated to Japan in 1946. He returned to a country in ruins, to cities burned by firebombing, to a people struggling to understand how they had lost a war they had been told they were winning. He spoke little of his experiences, but once, in 1968, interviewed by a local historian, he was asked what moment in the war had changed his perception of the enemy. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "The sound of their parachutes, like silk tearing. I heard it at dawn, and I knew we had already lost. Not the battle, the war. Because an army that can do that can send men falling from the sky into the jungle with full packs and rations and ammunition, that army cannot be beaten. Not by us, not by anyone." There is poetry in the image of a parachute. It is both a weapon and a surrender, a tool of aggression and a symbol of trust. The paratrooper, stepping from the door of an aircraft, commits an act of faith. He trusts the silk above him. He trusts his training. He trusts that the ground below, however hostile, can be taken and held. The Japanese had trusted in their fortifications, their discipline, their willingness to die. But trust alone is not enough. The Americans brought more than courage. They brought industry. They brought logistics. They brought the capacity to project power not just across oceans, but vertically from the sky itself. They brought K-rations and carbines and enough parachutes to drop entire regiments behind enemy lines again and again until the enemy stopped laughing and started retreating. The sound of silk became the sound of inevitability. It whispered through the jungles of New Guinea, over the cliffs of Corregidor, across the islands of the Pacific. It said, "We are here, we are coming, and there is no place you can hide that we cannot reach." The Japanese had mocked the idea of American paratroopers, but mockery is a poor defense against men willing to fall from the sky. And by the time the laughter stopped, the war was already over. It just took a few more years for everyone to realize it. The parachutes kept falling, the Americans kept landing, and the jungle, which was supposed to kill them, became theirs instead.